October 31st, 2019, Thursday. It was a cold Halloween morning. Around 5:37 a.m., a 911 call came through. The caller, Colby Trickle, was in a panic saying something was wrong at his house. When the officers arrived, they found his wife, Kristen Trickle, lying on bed, near dead, but still breathing. They jumped into action, giving her CPR. Even a pulse was recorded, but soon it became obvious. Kristen had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But amidst this, what made the scene even stranger was the way Kristen was discovered. She was practically naked with a large revolver across her stomach. She had been fatally shot under the chin, and all evidence showed that she took her own life. This felt rather odd. Naturally, when Kristen's family got to know about this, they wouldn't accept it. Dellen couldn't believe it at first. She didn't think it happened, especially when Colby said she herself took her life. But Dellen and Brandt knew Kristen inside and out. They couldn't imagine any way Kristen would take her own life. They described her as full of life, strong, and very connected to both her family and her dogs. The idea of her actually harming herself just didn't jive with the Kristen that they knew. In an attempt to clear it all out, what the authorities did was something never done before in a criminal case. A psychological autopsy on the victim, Kristen Trickle, and the findings confirmed that she killed herself. That wasn't the end of it. What happened next? Did she end her life or not? If yes, why did she commit such a thing? And if not, who killed her and why? Questions were many. And answers? Let's find out. Sergeant Branton Hopman of the Hayes Police Department will never forget the moment he saw Kristen's body. The whole thing didn't sit right with him, and it made him question if there was more than meets the eye. Hopman later spoke with Colby, asking him to come down to the station. Colby agreed. He told the investigators that earlier in the day, Kristen had come home from her job at Walmart's garden center, and the two of them had played video games before he went to bed. But when he woke up, his ears were ringing, and he found Kristen next to him with a gunshot wound to her head. He checked for a pulse but found none, so he dialed 911. And here people had divided opinion. Some people thought Colby did something, and some thought Kristen really ended her life. If we look at her past, Kristen had a rough start in life. Her mom left her when she was 2 years old. But when Kristen moved in with Dellen and Brandt at 17 years old, things began turning around. She grew into a very caring and positive person who never missed a moment with their family. Kristen was always great to Dellen and Brandt's daughter, Chloe. Kristen was also 18 years of age when she met Colby on the worship team at her uncle's church. He had gotten attention from Kristen by playing guitar and performing some original songs. Turned out Brandt and Dellen, who were really close to Kristen, have always been worried about the controlling behavior of Colby. They said that Colby would absolutely freak out if Kristen did not respond to his texts or calls immediately. If she is not around, he freaks out. Also, they said that because of the red flags in her relationship that they tried to discuss with Kristen, she began distancing herself from them. Eventually, after that, Kristen married Colby and moved to Kansas City with him. But things didn't go well financially. Colby did Army Reserve work and took odd jobs, and Kristen worked at the vet clinic. Then in early 2019, they moved back to the Hayes area, and Kristen started going back to their church, much to Brandt and Dellen's relief. They had hoped it was a sign that things were turning around for her. She even appeared to be getting her life on track. She was going to start a pet boarding business and had come across a small house with a barn she wanted to make the boarding area. For Brandt and Dellen, Kristen looked happy and hopeful about her future. But after Kristen's tragic death, Brandt and Dellen couldn't help but feel that Colby may have been involved. The coroner, Lyle Nordhook, though, looked at the scene and said the gunshot wound seemed to line up with a self-inflicted injury, pointing out that it looked like the gun had been held close to Kristen's chin. However, Detective J.B. Burkholder wasn't so sure. He thought it was odd because killing with gunshot to own head were rare for women. Usually, women are more concerned about their appearance, even after death. Plus, Kristen's cell phone alarm kept going off as if she was getting ready for work, which seemed pretty odd if she was planning to take her life. And there was candy set out in the kitchen for Halloween, which showed that Kristen was looking forward to trick-or-treating. Plus, then there was the gun itself. The .357 revolver was big, like 11 to 12 inches long. It seemed like something hard for someone with Kristen's build to handle, especially in a dimly lit room. So Burkholder didn't buy the idea that Kristen could have fired it herself. After Kristen died, Colby Trickle sat and talked to investigators for more than 11 hours. In fact, he insisted upon there being no argument or any drama with Kristen the night before she died. Still, the whole thing started feeling off. Colby Trickle was a U.S. military intelligence guy who had done tours in places like the Middle East and Central America. He told investigators about his job, which involved a lot of overseas work he described as movie stuff. According to Colby, when he discovered Kristen, he called 911, but then briefly considered using the gun on himself before he put it back on Kristen's body and ran outside. But Burkholder thought that was weird. If Colby was trying to get help, why put the gun back on her like that? Then the detectives probed if there was any life insurance involved, and Colby admitted that he had some military life insurance, but nothing on Kristen. When they asked him if he had anything to do with her death, he flat out said no. But things didn't sit right with first responder Sergeant Hopman. As the paramedics treated Kristen, Colby chatted with officers about video games, stuff like Counter-Strike, Call of Duty, and Minecraft, all caught on a police body cam. Hopman man was baffled by how cool Colby seemed to be under all the tension. How can a husband chit-chat about video games when his wife is dying? When the investigation took its course, Kristen's autopsy was performed. There was no sign of a struggle nor any defensive wounds. But what really threw them off was that Kristen had been found undressed, which didn't match the story Colby had told. That made them wonder if there's more to the story than what Colby was saying. So the police decided to check Colby's cell phone to find out what he was hiding. And what they found was worse. First, there were pretty graphic and inappropriate communications with another woman. This made it very difficult for the authorities not to wonder if he was on good terms with Kristen when communicating his relationship with the ex. They also figured that Colby lied when he denied knowing anything about life insurance taken out on her life. Because on his cell phone they discovered he had searched just days before Kristen died how much her life insurance policy would pay out. What is more specific, he had searched into the service members' group life insurance, also known as SGLI, 10 days before her death. So on November 4, 2019, investigators sat down with Colby for an interview and dropped a bombshell. They had found his online search history, specifically about Kristen's life insurance. Colby straight up denied it again, saying, "I never did." But when they pressed him further, his answer got a little more suspicious, and he said, If I would die," and the investigator cut in, "No, if your spouse died." Clearly, things were looking messy for Colby. Later on, Colby tried to explain the life insurance search by saying Kristen might have done it on his phone. He said they always shared their phones and had access to each other's stuff. But when the topic turned to his online relationship with another woman, Colby admitted that he had been talking to her for a few months before Kristen passed. They'd met in a group chat while playing video games, but Colby insisted it was just an online thing and they'd never met in person. It is here that it got really weird. In fact, the investigators were able to determine that Colby had been texting this woman just hours after Kristen's death, even while he was at the police station. First he said he was too busy to chat, then he added, "I wish I could," an odd thing to say for a man who was under investigation for his wife's death. However, investigators also probed into the claim Colby made that Kristen had used his phone to search for life insurance. To verify that, Detective Burkholder looked into the video footage of a Walmart store where Kristen worked and discovered that she was actually working during the time the search supposedly occurred. That completely shot down Colby's story that Kristen had been the one to use his phone. And then there were more inconsistencies. Colby had said that Kristen kept a .357 revolver on her side of the bed, but when the detectives checked out the crime scene, they found several guns on his side of the bed. Even weirder, Colby's phone had a picture of a big framed revolver on the bed. Burkholder realized that the .357 revolver Colby spoke about was pretty much the same gun he thought belonged to Kristen, and wasn't his. Now here is the thing. All these facts didn't even begin to add up, and in this investigation, it suffered a big blow when the coroner declared that Kristen took her own life. Such a declaration really put the screws on things since, as far as Kristen's death was concerned, police couldn't probe any deeper, nor look elsewhere for clues with the same importance. But on the other hand, the more evidence the authorities collected, the more it seemed like something was off. Detective Aaron Cunningham summed it up well. Even though all the signs pointed to foul play, the coroner's previous ruling just put the brakes on everything. Then came the winter of 2020, when Kristen's husband, Colby Trickle, began cashing in on 2 insurance policies after her death. He received $23,000 from Walmart and a whopping $100,000 from the military. Now, the coroner had already stated Kristen killed herself, which meant the cops could not get as easy search warrants, but they didn't stop there. They kept pushing and found some pretty weird stuff about Colby. He was a reserve officer, but he had never been deployed and never had any real experience in military intelligence, which he never admitted to the police. That made them ponder if Colby had really something to do with his wife's death. Colby just went about life as normal for the next year from there. People reported hearing him play music in his local restaurant to drive home the point. Then in January 2021, a new county attorney, Robert Anderson, entered the scene. Cunningham and another detective, J.B. Burkholder, brought it to his attention, and after reviewing the entire thing, Anderson concurred with the police. Kristen was actually murdered. And finally, Colby Trickle received a murder charge on July 14, 2021, for the death of his wife, Kristen. When the police came to take him away, Colby didn't appear all that surprised. He denied involvement in the crime, though he knew a lot of people didn't believe him. Enter Cassie Ziegler, Colby's defense lawyer. She is a devout Christian and concerned with Colby's spiritual well-being, but frankly, she does not think much of how he is dealing with it. She believes that how Colby twists the situation is much more apparent than any spiritual growth on his part. Ziegler mentioned Kristen's battle with depression, pointing out that Kristen had struggled with depression for years, particularly when her biological mom rejected her in the early years. Ziegler believed that to be a deep emotional wound that greatly contributed to Kristen's suffering. She insisted that Kristen's suffering was not well understood by those around her. When the trial began, Ziegler was fairly confident that her case would be heard, as she was basing much of her argument on the coroner's report, which indicated Kristen took her own life. The coroner would not budge, insisting that unless there was some major new evidence, the ruling would not change. But then the county attorney Anderson came in swinging to prove to the jury that Kristen was murdered. He hired forensic psychologist Dr. Ashley Christensen to do a psychological autopsy to make his case. He interviewed everybody close to Kristen, family, friends, and co-workers, and dug deep into her social media, diaries, and journals. All of this research would play a huge part in the trial, setting the direction of the case. At the September 2023 trial, Prosecutor Cunningham was straightforward about the case that Colby had an affair, then lost control of the situation, and finally wanted to cash in on some life insurance. But that's not all. But defense attorney Ziegler wouldn't have it. She said the affair wasn't anything serious, just a brief online flirtation, not some long-term relationship. As for the whole financial motive idea, she denied Colby had any plans to kill Kristen for money. Then they brought up the life insurance search. Ziegler said Colby didn't recall searching for it. She admitted, however, that Colby was doing his own military life insurance paperwork at the time. If Colby looked up Kristen's life insurance, she said perhaps it was just a bad coincidence timing-wise with her death. The jury also discovered that Colby had received more than $120,000 from 2 life insurance policies on Kristen and spent it all within less than a year. And guess what was one of his more interesting purchases? A nearly $2,000 life-size sex doll from a company called True Touch Dolls. Colby's defense said he bought the doll to help him sleep better because he was struggling to be alone at night. He even talked about it with his mom. But Detective J.B. Burkholder wasn't exactly impressed with that explanation. Then there was testimony from Branton, who said Kristen had been more assertive in the months before her death. She had even texted Colby saying she was taking control of her life, which seemed to go against Colby's idea that he was losing control of her. Another key witness, Dr. Ashley Christensen, who did the psychological autopsy, further said that Kristen was optimistic concerning the future. even at one point mentioning opening up a pet boarding business. Colby, however, felt she might have been stressed as a result of learning he was online with another lady. But the mismatch was, in his police interview, Colby denied that Kristen ever knew about the affair, a point that has left a lot of people questioning him. After all, Dr. Christensen didn't think Kristen killed herself, but the defense wasn't so sure, arguing that her report was unreliable since it was based on interviews done almost 2 years after Kristen passed away. And the trial occurred nearly 4 years after Kristen was tragically shot and killed. Colby's mom testified and stated that Kristen was very quiet and emotionless, which contradicted what other family members said about her being more of a happy-go-lucky type. Defense attorneys tried to suggest that Colby's emotional affair online may have pushed Kristen over the edge, making it the last straw that led to her death. But the prosecutor, Aaron Cunningham, intervened with a great point. He mentioned that the weapon that murdered Kristen showed that no way she could take her own life. He questioned a mark on the autopsy pictures, this little impression from the gun's sight at the 3 o'clock angle. Since Kristen was right-handed, the coroner said if she had shot herself, the mark would have been at a different angle, like 9 o'clock or 6 o'clock. But this was more at 3 o'clock, meaning something wasn't adding up. Cunningham went further, explaining how Colby could have grabbed the gun from the nightstand, rolled over in bed, and shot Kristen while she was sleeping, aiming under her chin. It was just a theory, but her neck wound matched that theory. However, after all these back and forth, just less than 2 hours after the jurors departed, they returned a verdict: guilty. Colby was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder and messing with the law by lying. After the verdict came in, Coroner Lyle Nordhook took a moment to reflect on his original ruling. He admitted when he first concluded that Kristen took her own life, he hadn't spoken to her family or even investigated the weapon. He realized he didn't have all the facts. He didn't know the size of the weapon or anything about Colby's secret online affair. Nordhook also confessed that if he had known what research Colby did on shady insurance and the affair, perhaps he wouldn't have declared that she killed herself in the first place. He was going to change Kristen's death certificate to list this as a homicide instead. Another admission made by him in his testimony was that bad communication between the investigators and the coroner's office was sloppy. The researchers thought that they should have included Nordhook in the beginning. Fast forward to November 20th, 2023. Colby Trickle was sentenced to life without parole for 50 years. In court, Colby said he could have been a better husband, but could not apologize for hurting Kristen, because he could not apologize for something he did not do. He indeed confessed that he could have played a role in the events that led to Kristen's death, and whether his involvement somehow contributed to her tragic end. Do you think Colby was telling the truth, or do you think it's him who killed Kristen for money? Tell us in the comment section. And just like this case was solved by psychological autopsy, something unusual, here is another case that was solved by a tree. Check this out. Subscribe to this channel for more. See you soon.